Today I'm going to talk about the introduction of the World Wide Web to the general public and how it led to the creation of the cybersecurity industry we know today. First of all, we need to understand the difference between the World Wide Web and the Internet, because there is a difference.
And what about this Internet thing? Do you know anything about that?
Sure.
What the hell is that exactly?
Before the World Wide Web existed, the Internet was not one large public network. It was individual connections in between two or more devices, similar to what we know today as a LAN. Tim Berners-Lee at CERN recognized that these networks needed more interconnectivity capabilities among the devices that were using it. He was a contractor who was tasked with doing research on several different isolated networks at CERN, and he realized it was becoming more and more tedious to share data across these segmented networks. So he facilitated this process by inventing the World Wide Web, which was possible due to the standard language HTML. And this is what allowed people to share files and communicate across these isolated networks. And so as more and more of these isolated networks began adopting HTML and the concept of the World Wide Web, it kept growing and growing into the internet that we know today. The first serious cybercrime issues started happening in the early 90s. There were shady things going on in the late 80s as well, but it was mostly phreaking and phone lines and things like that. There was not true, widespread, advanced, persistent threats like we have now. So now it's 1990. Now we have the World Wide Web, everyone talking through HTML. Everyone's able to connect to everyone else. Everyone can attack everyone else. And so because of this, it's clear to see how the cybersecurity industry grew from this. I've created a visual diagram sort of how I see this cycle happening constantly, starting in the early 90s and still continues through today. Right, so using the invention of the World Wide Web as step one, technology evolves. This was Tim Berners-Lee helping technology evolve to the next level. So in phase two, the initial laws and policies, this is where companies attempt to create rules for the end user. They're not technical mechanisms of control. They're not intended to actually prevent anyone from doing anything, but they're legal terms meant to deter criminal activity. The developers of the new technology and even law enforcement sometimes attempt to create the narrative of how users are expected to utilize the new tools, because as new technology, there really are no guidelines unless we set them for the users. Step three is when all eyes are on the new technology after it's released, and all the attackers just have a field day testing it for vulnerabilities and looking for any foothold they can get in. This is usually when the software is at its weakest point, if it hasn't been thoroughly and properly tested for vulnerabilities, because this is the first chance basically the whole world gets to take it apart and attack it. And this phase also occurs in spite of the previous phase, the initial laws and policies. This is actually when the bad guys disregard those laws and policies and attempt to break in anyway. Once the new software is released and the initial phase of attacks has passed, the developers and lawmakers have a better idea of how attackers might leverage this new technology. Right? I mean, that's how the DMCA was established, because people were sharing copyrighted content on the World Wide Web. And so they had to create this new law because of new technology. And so the more new technology gets used, the more society has an understanding of how those uses may start encroaching on ethical or legal issues. And so initial laws and policies have to get revised and updated and ultimately evolve to something more appropriate for the current technology. So now we have updated laws and policies to reflect the new technology that was released. And what do the criminals do? They sidestep the new laws with loopholes. So for example, the DMCA comes out. This is when we start seeing an uptick in VPN usage, and Tor comes around later on down the line. Now, these are used to evade law enforcement so that they can continue pirating copyrighted software, images, videos, things like that. That is not the primary use or purpose of VPNs or Tor, but the point is that cybercrime evolves to use different technologies to adapt to laws and circumvent laws and things like that. So the point of this cycle is new technology comes out, and that drives new cybercrime. And then technology is once again forced to evolve to defend against cybercrime. So with all that being said, thanks for sticking with me through this video, and next week I'm going to talk about how law enforcement actually started cracking down on the hackers and violation of these laws, and we'll talk about some nationwide takedowns. Thanks.